SettleIndex is cloud-based software for carrying out litigation risk assessments. It uses principles, I think, that most people would understand, that were actually first published 300 years ago by a Dutch polymath called Daniel Bernoulli. And his paper was about how you calculate the value of a chance. So I think most people now will be familiar with his theory about how to calculate a chance at a basic level. And when I'm talking about litigation risk assessment to an audience, I always give the example of tossing a coin. In fact, I would probably say to you, how about this bet? If I toss a coin, if it comes up heads, I'll pay you £2. If it comes up tails, you can pay me £1. Now, most people would start off thinking that must be some sort of trick going on here, because they think obviously it's better for them to take the bet, because they're going to get twice as much as they expect for winning. And most people instinctively understand that tossing a coin is a 50-50 bet. And to be honest, litigation risk assessment starts with that very simple principle and goes from there. And the problem with litigation is that it's rarely as simple as just tossing a coin. So, for example, in a typical court case, you might have a lot of complicated issues around liability. There will be potentially a lot of heads of damage and a lot of arguments about how much the damages should be, what damage is attached to what heads of liability if you are liable. And so you can end up with a lot of variables. And on top of that, there can be cost orders that are made, and they can be issue-based cost orders. They can be affected by Part 36 offers and other sorts of without prejudice offers. And so those also are complex and they have different chances. And so what you end up with is a matrix of risks and values that are almost impossible to do in your head. And that's why you need a financial model. And that's what SettleIndex provides, a bespoke software for doing these sorts of calculations. Well, I've always been very passionate about litigation risk assessment in my professional career. And the problem that lawyers have is they tend to think, obviously, and speak in terms of words, but at the end of the day, 95% of cases are settled. And to settle a case, you have to translate your advice about legal risk into cash. And this has to be done in every financial dispute. And most lawyers, if they do anything at all, don't really do what I would regard as being a full job on litigation risk assessment. But actually, if you advise your client on the value of a settlement offer, you are in effect creating a financial model in your head. You are telling the client what you think that claim is worth. And there is, and still is, really very little in the way of software available for a lawyer to use. So lawyers that were doing sophisticated models and are doing sophisticated models will tend to be doing them in Excel. But the idea behind SettleIndex is that it can be used by any lawyer with minimal training and used to create a sophisticated financial model to assist in advising on the value of a dispute. And I have seen how effective this is in my practice as a mediator. When I do mediations, I offer the parties a session with SettleIndex, generally in advance of the mediation. And on a number of occasions, I've seen it create a really big impact in terms of the position of the parties going into the mediation. And it's normally been very accurate in forecasting the likely area of where the mediation is going to settle. I suppose its main function is it helps parties to find a settlement range for the dispute, the values to them that the range of values within which they might settle the case, taking into account, importantly, their planned cost spend. And it also, and I think this is unusual in the few types of software that are around that do this, we unusually allow parties and indeed encourage them to model the settlement range of the opponents. And if I show you my screen, I can show you how that works. We're looking here at a model that has already been made earlier by me. It's obviously just a demonstration, not a real case. But you'll see there's a green line on the bottom, and that is the settlement range for the claimant. And there's a purple line on the top, which is the claimant's view of how the defendant might be seeing the case. And you'll see that if you establish those two ranges, and I'll explain a bit how you do that in a moment, the two lines very often, nearly always, not always, but most often they cross. And where they cross, we calculate the value of that point, which happens to be £250 in this case. And so what that's saying is that if the assumptions behind the risks for the claimant and the assumptions behind the claimant's view of how the defendant might see the case are correct, then the probable settlement value of that case would be where those two lines intersect. And the green triangle is an area which at the beginning of the case, so on the left-hand side where we're looking now, that's the value of the both parties' cases before they start spending costs. And over here is the value after they've spent the costs. And you'll see the lines converge on each other. The amount the defendant is worth paying to settle the case goes down as he spends money. And as far as the claimant is concerned, the amount they need to settle goes up as they spend money. And so you get this triangle, and the green area is the area where any settlement between the parties will be better than their opening position. And if they go on in dispute and don't settle it, and they spend costs down to this point, which in this case is about 75% of the cost spend, if they then carried on and settled somewhere in that compromised purple triangle, that would be a worse result for both parties than if they had done the deal that they could have done anywhere in the green at the beginning of the case. So it's a powerful indicator to clients and indeed to lawyers that the importance of trying to work out what the case is worth and settle it early, because all cases work this way in terms of value. And unless you find something in the course of the investigation that radically changes the value by moving inexorably towards this compromise point by spending costs, you're actually slowly reducing the value of the case if you can't just settle there straight away. So also what you'll pick up from this illustration is that the economics of settling cases is almost diametrically opposite to the way in which they happen. So typically, for most cases, the best value for the best opportunity to settle a case is in reality early on, before costs are spent. And as costs are spent, the possibilities for settlement get narrower and sometimes disappear altogether. So that is what you see from this illustration. The other point that comes out quite strongly from using this sort of financial modeling is issues with costs. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we look here, this is a very simple case. I've just had two outcomes. One is that the claimant wins and gets £500, you'll see that claim there, and gets 75% of their costs back. And the other option is the claimant loses and pays 75% of the defendant's costs, which are the same as their costs. And I've said that the chances of the claimant winning are 60%. So obviously there's a chance of 40% of losing. And what you can see is that the value of the claim to the damages is £300, which you can work out in your head. 60% of 500 is £300. But the value of the chance of getting your costs paid is only £75, because whilst you've got a 60% chance of getting 375, you have to deduct from that a 40% chance of paying 375. So the net cost recovery is £75 out of 500 in this model. And I think that's a very important and little understood point. And it comes up a lot at mediations, because very often claimants approach mediations on the basis that they'll settle for a proportion of their claim plus all of their costs. And this, of course, is consistent with, for example, court judgments, where sometimes you don't get all of your claim, but the court might award you all of your costs. Not always, but that can happen. And similarly, if you make a Part 36 offer, normally you offer to pay all of the claimant's costs, even though you may only be offering part of the claim. However, when you're negotiating a settlement, it's based on risk, and the valuation of the risk should take into account the chances of winning and losing. So in this case, the value is £375 for settling this case. And if you've only spent £25 in costs at this point, you should still technically be able to settle it for £375. If, on the other hand, you spent £400 on costs, you will probably, your settlement value is still only £375. So you would actually end up £25 worse off through doing a deal at that level. And I think this, as I say, I see this very often at mediations where a huge amount of costs have been run up by a claimant and they can't get the defendants to pay it. And typically those are the cases where the defendant will make a payment, but it's not enough to give the claimant a profit, and everyone ends up with a sort of Pyrrhic result where nobody has done very well. And so that is something that needs to be looked at very carefully when you're planning the strategy for a case. So as well as that, in general, using a financial model, I think, gives clients a sense of security. It gives you an ability to explain why, for example, for a claimant, you are suggesting they should settle for less than they think their claim is worth. Alternatively, if you're advising a defendant, you can advise them why it is worth paying more than they think they would like to pay. And there is also a visual map that is produced. This is very simple in this case. It's claimant wins, claimant loses, but you could have and can have a very complex map, but it allows you to follow through all the twists and turns of the litigation and see what the possible outcomes might be. In some senses, SettleIndex is a jack of all trades. Its primary function, as I've said, is to allow lawyers very easily to make complex models of litigation risk. But that is, of course, one of the key aspects for mediation. Almost 95% or more of cases now settle by agreement, and a large number of those agreements are made at mediation, if not beforehand in correspondence. And for that purpose, you need to do a list. It helps to have done a risk model and to have worked out what the appropriate settlement value is. So it's actually critically important for mediations. But the other things that it does, because you create these financial models on cloud-based software, it records the data. It records key figures that you enter, and a lot of those figures are numbers that wouldn't normally exist if you didn't do a model. But once you have them, you can track the progress of the case. You can see whether your settlement value is going up or down. You can see whether spending your costs is actually increasing the value of the claim or reducing it. And I would say that although it's very handy at mediation, very often if you use it just before mediation, in my mind, it's almost too late, because anything you could have learnt about the case through the modelling, apart from its settlement value, is, that opportunity is gone because you're about to settle the case. So I would say the best use of a SettleIndex is to make a model almost as soon as you start a case, if you're a lawyer, and then you periodically update it as you go along, and you use the software to do what if type calculations. Would it help to get this bit of evidence? What difference do I think disclosure would make if I got some really good documents in disclosure? How good do I think that would make? How much do I think that would increase or reduce the settlement value? So to me, it's very important to use it early on. And the other thing that creating a model at the outset does is makes you think about all the possible linked things that could happen in the case, and what you don't know and what you need to know. What are the big uncertainties that make a big difference to the value, that it's worth finding out. But at the same time, it can often show you that some things that you might spend time looking at really don't make much difference and can be ignored. And ultimately, once you have a lot of cases in here, the data from past cases can be used to some extent to inform future cases. It'll give an idea of typically what range of settlements are achieved against evaluations, against initial evaluations. But nobody should think, however, that this is replacing lawyers. In fact, it's almost the opposite. It depends on the experience and skills of the lawyers entering the data to produce the output. It's a typical, if you like, computer program, garbage in, garbage out. So it's really just a way of helping lawyers translate what they already know, their feelings about the chances, their feelings about the values, into this more rigorous financial model. So it's a tool to help them, but it's not a substitute for their understanding and investigation of the case. And I think different class of users will use it differently. So we expect insurers to use it because they're obviously very big litigators, and they will be very interested in the data that comes from modeling lots of cases. Lawyers, I think, will use it to help them with difficult decisions, difficult advice they're having to give their clients. And in some ways, corporates are in the same sort of position. Corporates that find themselves involved in litigation will want to know what the value of the claim is. And if you're trying to persuade a board to agree to a settlement value, then having a financial model that you can show them and discuss at a board meeting or with the in-house counsel is invaluable. We're obviously very keen for lawyers to try out this software. We announced its launch in January this year, and ADR Group have negotiated with us a deal which is as follows: that any firm that has not used the software but has a mediation booked through ADR Group will be welcome to try out the software for the purpose of that mediation for no charge. And in addition, we will be happy to help the lawyers using the software, give them a training session. And typically a training session would involve an hour where we would just help you input the case that you're actually about to mediate. We don't do training on theoretical cases. We literally just help you to set up a case. And I should say, once you set up a case, it's entirely controlled by you. You have access to it. We as a company don't have access to our customer cases. So we would do the initial modeling session, sharing the screen. I would sign any confidentiality agreements that you might require. And then you would be able to create the model, and then you would have it and you'd be able to update it and change it if needs be as time went on. And that offer is to any firm that hasn't already had someone in the firm using the software.